Very good to see all of you here. I'm very glad to be back at the Great Gathering again, and very glad to be speaking with you all. So what I'll do is I'll start with a little story. Yeah? The way you hook them in is you start with a little story. So I'm going to start with a little story, and the story goes back to I was in university. I was deeply unhappy, deeply depressed at the time. I was in UCD, which was this university in Dublin, which is this grey sort of block. It was built in the 1960s. It sported the largest prefab in Europe at one point. That'll give you a bit of an idea. Its science department was the largest prefabricated building in Europe, so give you a bit of a sense of the place. And I was coming out of the campus one day. I was going to make the cycle up home. I lived about a 20 or 30-minute cycle away, so I was about to cycle up home, and this nun, this sister of a particular order, was giving out leaflets outside the campus, and I'd not seen her before or come across her before. My sense is that probably she belonged to one of these orders dedicated to Mary, to Jesus' mother Mary, but I can't be too sure. But she came up to me anyway, and she said, and she must have spotted a young man that was in a need of a bit of help, because I probably wasn't looking particularly happy. And she came up and she said, "Have you heard of our Virgin Mary?" And being a sort of dedicated atheist at the time, and a hardcore Marxist at the time, I said to her, "Well, that would be the easy way out, wouldn't it?" I said, "That would be the easy way out." I mean, we're not talking genius levels of rhetoric here. It's not exactly the Oxford debates, is it? I mean, that would be the easy way out of all the things that you could say. Not that intelligent, but I said, "That would be the easy way out." And she said, "Yes, it would." She did. You did, which put, you know, sort of thought touche, you know. So, so it sort of got me thinking about how we relate to suffering and our existential situation, isn't it? It's interesting. Why not take the easy way out, in a sense? And this relates back to the story of well, the theme of the weekend, which is this theme of the burning house. And the burning house is a story. It goes back to the White Lotus Sutra. And the story goes that basically the Buddha is giving a teaching, not only to the monks, the arahats, but also the bodhisattvas, the devas. They're all there in attendance. And the Buddha gives this teaching, this parable of the burning house. And he tells... the parable goes that once upon a time there was this very, very rich man. Very rich man, and he lived in this enormous sort of palace. He's described as a multi-millionaire these days, and he lives in this enormous, enormous palace, but it's become sort of dilapidated and it's falling apart. And with this, in this particular palace, he lives with his 30 children and all his dependents, so all his servants, all his maids, all of the people that sort of take care of him and is dependent on him. And in the story, because this house is sort of dilapidated and falling apart, it starts to catch fire. It starts to catch fire. And the old man, who happens to be outside of the palace, sees this and he starts to get very worried, because he's got his 30 children in there and he's very, very concerned for them. As you would be, you know, you've got 30 children. And they're in a burning house, you'd be very, very concerned. So he loves his children dearly and he wants to get them out, but he's now in a bit of a quandary, because he knows he can't sort of pick them up. He can't run and pick them up and force them out, carry them out. That's not going to work. It's not going to be practicable. So he starts to worry, well, what is it that I can do to get out, to get my children out? And so he calls to them. He says, "Look, the house is on fire, the palace is on fire. Get out, you have to get out now." But the children, of course, being children, you know, you ever tell children in the midst of sort of excitement to do something, I mean, how much response do you get? Zero, pretty much, isn't it? You know, irrespective of how authoritative you think you might be. Children, when they're in the midst of games, they don't listen. do they? They don't hear you. So he's calling out to his children, and he's saying, get out, the house is on fire. But they're just completely sort of caught up in the games that they're playing. They have all their toys, they're playing whatever they're playing with each other, and they're completely caught up in their games, and they don't hear. So the old man decides that, okay, we're going to need to take a little bit of a different tact, and starts to promise them toys. He says, no, come out here, I have amazing toys out here, I have these wonderful toys out here. And of course, all of a sudden, the children sort of, toys, you say? And they come out, they all start rushing out of the house, all in one go. And when they come out, they sort of fall and trample and climb over each other, and then eventually all 30 of the children get out of the house and are there with the old man, the father. And when they get out, not only does the father, the old man, give them toys, but he gives them bigger and better toys than they could have ever imagined. So in the story, big sort of bullock carts. Can't imagine that being what you'd give to a child now, but that's what the children wanted in India then. So big sort of bullock carts and sort of, you know, these amazing kind of things. And the children are delighted. They're absolutely delighted, you know. And so the old man gets his children out, and the children get not only what they want, but far, far more as well. Now, there's a lot of symbolism in that story, so I'm not going to sort of unpack it all. And in a sense, a parable it's its own explanation. Actually, one way I could just sort of finish this talk up right now, and that would be enough. You'd feel shortchanged, so I won't do that. But that would be enough. A parable just the explanation is in the parable itself. It's an emotional and a poetic explanation, but you could just sort of dwell on the story over and over again, bring it to mind over and again, and the explanation would come out of that. But I will draw out a few things. So the house in this particular instance is the world. And it's the world on a sort of objective level and on a subjective level as well. And it's so clear to see that the world is on fire at the moment, isn't it? I mean, and that can be slightly cliched. People go, desperately these days, as if it's getting worse and worse and worse. I'm not particularly convinced of that. I think the world is always on fire, but it becomes more obvious to us at times as well. And it's very, very obvious at the moment that the world is on fire. And Mike Trinar was saying in his introduction that I'd spent time in the Middle East. I'd actually spent time, I lived in the West Bank and Gaza for a time when I was a young man. And so, I've been very upset looking at the situation in Gaza unfold over the last few months. Absolutely horrific. The level of human suffering just really quite unimaginable in a certain sort of way. It's very hard to sort of imagine it. And of course, the attacks of October 7th, similarly, sort of the suffering involved in the loss of life there, just really, really unimaginable, I think, for most of us. Hopefully unimaginable for most of us. But it's very, very clear that situation is on fire, isn't it? It's burning. And though I don't think, and I'd be dishonest to say that my experience of that particular conflict was a sort of, on the relative level, on the social level, the political level, the military level, a two-sided conflict. I don't think it is. And I think sometimes there can be a sort of naive kind of both sidesism, which is often just a refusal to think clearly about a situation. So I don't, in all honesty, that wasn't my experience of it. But what there is underneath that conflict is there's this set of conditions of greed, hatred, and delusion. Yeah? And with any conflict that you get at any part of the world, underneath the relative, at a sort of more sort of, you could even say, existential level, or even a sort of metaphysical level, word sort of, I'm not finding quite the right word, but you could say the existential level, there are these conditions, shared conditions of greed, hatred, and delusion, which of course both Israelis and Palestinians share in, don't they? They share in those existential conditions of greed, hatred, and delusion. And not only do Israelis and Palestinians share in that particular condition, but we share in those conditions as well. So you could say that actually on the metaphysical level, any conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict, but any conflict is, all of us have culpability in that conflict because we all share in the basic conditions of greed, hatred and delusion which give rise to that. We're lucky enough that we don't live in a situation which doesn't set that tinderbox on fire. So you can imagine we all as unenlightened beings, share in that capacity for fire just to go up at any particular time. Now we're lucky, we're very lucky in that particular extent that with us, that spark hasn't set that off. But it very, very easily could. I mean, you could look at, say, for example, at the situation in Northern Ireland, deep, deep hatred and conflict. And it's only just basically down the road, really, or a hop over the water or down the road, you know, in the sense of this incredibly deep conflict that gave rise to so much suffering and is still being felt in Northern Ireland today. That cloud sort of still hangs over it a bit in Northern Ireland today. I mean, amongst many other things as well, but so much suffering. And of course, you know, we don't often sort of clock that we could fall into that level of hatred and spite and harm because we're not particularly tested. I know I wouldn't behave well in a situation that really tested me like that as well. So we share in culpability. We share in culpability for any conflict around the world, because we're part of the conditions that give rise on the existential level. We're part of the conditions that give rise to that conflict. We're part of the problem, basically, and that's just a natural aspect of being human beings. We don't have to beat ourselves up over that. You know, that's just a natural aspect of being unenlightened human beings, that we can fall into that. So that's the fire, and the children are deeply intoxicated, aren't they? They're completely sort of caught up in their games. So you could say they're completely sort of intoxicated by the situation. They don't see the danger. They don't see the danger that they're in. And of course, that's what happens when we're intoxicated, literally intoxicated. We don't sort of spot danger, do we? If you've gone out and you've had whatever your 9 or 10 lagers of a Saturday night, you don't tend to sort of spot danger very easily, do you? So we're sort of intoxicated to the danger around us, and we're intoxicated in various ways. And I think it goes right back to the story of the Buddha. Many of you will know it, where on the Buddha's being born, the Buddha's father went to a sort of soothsayer, a kind of future teller, and asked what would become of his son. The father was a statesman and wanted his son to become a statesman as well, Gautama to become a statesman. And the fortune teller said, well, he would either be a great statesman or he'd be a great sage, a great spiritual leader. And of course, the father wants him to be a great statesman, wants Gautama to be a great statesman. So he intoxicates the Buddha. He gives him everything that he could possibly need to prevent him from seeing his existential situation, to intoxicate him from the deeper questions in life, the questions that tend to provoke a spiritual journey or a spiritual quest. He keeps him from those, so he keeps them intoxicated. Dancing girls, games, military games, training, palaces, music, sense, sort of pleasures, all of those sorts of things. He just kind of intoxicates with them in the hope that the Buddha-to-be, Gautama, won't see his existential situation and won't look to sort of escape, won't look to get out. But of course we know that's not what happens in the story, and the Buddha steals out of an evening and over a series of sort of 3 evenings, taken out, helped out by his charioteer, he sees these 3 sights, and the 3 sights are the sights of a sick man, an old man, and a dead man. So a sick man, an old man, and a dead man. And then you could think of this metaphorically. It's unlikely that historically that this was the first time the Buddha saw these things. That's quite unlikely. But you can think of this set of metaphorically as when you really see those things for the first time, don't you? When you really sort of clock old age, sickness and death for the first time. And it sort of kind of really sort of strikes you. It's really hard to sort of grasp those in reality, isn't it? You get the sort of, you know it's going to happen intellectually, conceptually, but it's very hard to grasp the reality that we will all grow old, we will become sick. We will hopefully all grow old, we will become sick and we'll die. It's very, very hard to do that. But these three sites are said to be the remedy for the three intoxications. So the three sort of main intoxications of unenlightened experience, which is the intoxication of health, the intoxication of youth, and the intoxication of death. So the things that, of life. So the intoxication of health, the intoxication of youth, and the intoxication of life. So the three ways in which the three main ways in which we are intoxicated, we don't see our existential situation of old age, sickness and death, because we're too intoxicated to see it. So this sense of intoxication, I'll go into a little these three intoxications, but just to say a bit more about that. When we're intoxicated, it's like, well, we don't sense danger, as I was saying, but we think we can't be touched, don't we? When we're sort of intoxicated, we think we can't be touched. When we're intoxicated by youth, it's impossible to think we grow older. You know, with young people, when you see them, when young people are intoxicated by youth, there's a sort of swagger to youth, isn't there? There's a sort of, oh, and what you get, you know, you don't like it, well, tough sort of swagger to youth. The idea that you're going to get old is just ludicrous when you're young. I was watching on YouTube a little while ago, and somebody just went up to somebody and asked them, you know, he'd asked him his age. He said, oh, I'm 77. And he said, what's it like getting old? And a very interesting answer that this guy gave. He said, it's interesting. The older that you get, you look out from the same eyes, but people look right through you. And I thought, that's really interesting, isn't it? You look out from the same eyes, come from the same place yourself, but people start to look right through you. And that's, of course, the intoxication of youth, isn't it? Old people don't sort of exist, and you're definitely not going to get old. So you're intoxicated to the danger of getting old and sick, the existential situation of getting old and sick. And what happens then is we forget bigger considerations, because whenever you're intoxicated, you think you really can't be sort of touched. I've particularly noticed this with success, actually. The other thing that I've noticed that you can really sort of intoxicate with yourself with is success, which is incredibly dangerous, is just a little bit of success. I've noticed this in my old life, my own life, maybe you've noticed it as well, whereby when you get the thing that you want, it's most likely to be the time that you really muck it up. Yeah? Just when you get that thing you want, it's most likely to be the time that you're really going to muck it up. And I've seen this with friends as well. They want this thing, they push for this thing, they get it, and then they shoot themselves in the foot. Because we think, because you become intoxicated with the success, and you think, well, I can't, ethical considerations don't apply to me. Existential situations don't apply to me. You start to identify with the success as being your own. You think, I've done this, this is me. You forget that you've probably got a little help. You forget that it's been blind luck a lot of the time. And you forgot that if you've got it off your own help, off your own work, it's because you've been ethical and you've worked skillfully towards something. You forget all that so often with success, don't you? And you think, no, this success is because of me. It's mine. And you forget the conditions that have gone into it. And of course, then you get a bit of sort of bravado and kind of braggadocio about you. And you really mess it up. So I've noticed the intoxication of success to be particularly sort of dangerous. So that when you get a little bit of success, and when I always remind myself if things start to go well, it's like, and now you really watch it, Amalayodhin. now you really need to be careful because you'll get inflated and then you'll shoot yourself in the foot. So there's the intoxication of success in that particular way as well. And when we're healthy, the intoxication of health is clear as well. You don't think you could ever get sick, do you? I've been slightly interested. I've been thinking a bit about these three intoxications because I've been thinking a bit about the intoxication of life as well, which is a strange one, isn't it, to think that you can be intoxicated by being alive, with being alive. You think you can't be intoxicated with being alive. You can't be sort of inflated with being alive. But it's interesting because I think you can. You might notice this, for example, where I particularly notice this is with at funerals. I've noticed it in myself at funerals and in other people at funerals as well. You can sometimes get this sort of inflated kind of sense that wasn't this person very silly to die? You can get that kind of atmosphere in a funeral where the person is talked about as if you were somehow immortal and it wasn't going to happen to you. Like how silly of them to die. You get this in literature as well. You sort of Dickens pointed it out. I remember first reading about it in Dickens in Great Expectations. Pip's mum dies and Dickens talks about a particular character at the funeral who talks as if he was a different variety of being who was never going to die, who was basically immortal, and how silly of this person to be so clumsy as to go and die. Yeah, you'll sort of notice this sometimes in the kind of the way that people communicate at funerals. I've noticed it in myself as well. So there is a kind of intoxication with life, isn't it? This idea that we've been very clever to be alive, and it's because we're very clever that we're not dead. That's not the reality of things, isn't it? So you can get this kind of pride, this intoxication with being alive. So I think it can be very, very good just to sort of take every opportunity to remind ourselves that we are in the burning house. And part of that means that we will die. You absolutely will die. Part of sort of the wheel, samsaric existence, the existential danger of that is that we are prone to death, that we will die. And it's so hard just to sort of clock it. I've got some emails recently of people, you know, my age and younger actually at the LBC, just saying why they'd be away. They'd have an absence of time away from the centre, and it's because they've got very serious diagnoses of cancer. You get sort of woken up to the fact that death is just sort of prevalent and can happen at any time. And really, I think you need to take advantage of situations where you come across that and you really use it to reflect, well, this will be me as well, very soon, in fact. Life goes by just incredibly quickly, especially as you start to get older. It just goes by so fast. And in the tradition, it's described almost just like as, you know, as like a lightning fork. That's how quickly it goes by. Life just goes by very, very quickly. So really using the opportunities that we have to reflect, no, I will die. I am prone to death as well. Partly, I think, what a reflection on death, a proper reflection on death, is looking to counter not only this sort of intoxication with life, is a kind of complacency around the amount of time that we have for practice. We can get very, very complacent thinking, oh, there's plenty of time for practice, for Dharma practice. I'm doing this now, I'm enjoying this now. But actually, if we really sort of recognised the situation that we're in and how soon death was around the corner, we would really take that opportunity for practice now, for Dharma practice now. There's a very good sutta actually in the Pali Canon, which is the teachings of the Buddha, the historical teachings of Gautama the Buddha. And in this sutta, it's the simile of the mountains. And in this sutta, King Pasenadi comes to the Buddha, and he sits down next to him, and he says he's just come from a meeting of his various ministers and advisors, and he said they were inflated. I think he said we were inflated with the business, intoxicated with the business of government and sovereignty and power. You know the sort of, you can imagine the scene, can't you? A group of men sort of just completely kind of intoxicated with the intoxication of sovereignty and power and status. You know, a little bit of that in Parliament this week, didn't you? With MPs sort of really making themselves look quite foolish with a sort of puffed up kind of self-importance, intoxicated on their own supposed power. And so you can imagine the scene, and the Buddha says to King Pasenadi, he says, King, if you could imagine a mountain coming from all sides, if messengers were to come from you from all directions, and they were to, from the north, south, east, and west, and they were say to you, King, there is a mountain as high as the clouds going up into the sky, and it's coming this way, and all before it, it crushes. All before it, it crushes. So this mountain coming from all sides, coming this way, moving very quickly, and all before it, it crushes. And the Buddha says to the king, what would be the appropriate response in that particular instance? And the king says, well, Lord, of course it would just be to practice the Dhamma. You know, if that was what was happening, if a mountain that high was coming from all sides and crushing everybody, the only response would be to practice the Dhamma. That's what would be sort of important. That's what you'd recognize as important. The values of love, friendliness, generosity, courage, all of those things would become what's important in the face of that situation. And of course, the Buddha says, well, that is the situation that we're facing, actually. Death comes to us from all sides. And just like in that situation, given our situation, existential situation, the thing that's important, given that context, is that we practice the values that are of most meaning to us. That's often when you hear people who have been diagnosed with, say, a terminal cancer or something like that. They know they're going to die. All of a sudden, everything falls into perspective, doesn't it? You could imagine if you knew you were going to die, if you had just a short time to live, however short that might be, you'd think, well, the most important thing now is just to practice, to be loving, to be courageous, to be generous, kind, all of those things, truthful, all of those things would be the most important thing. You get that in the Dhammapada as well, don't you? Where the Buddha says that men who realize that they're going to die compose their quarrels. You can imagine you just wouldn't quarrel in the face knowing that you were going to die, because it would just have no importance. The thing would be so, whatever the small little silly quarrels that we get into would be put into its right perspective, and you'd recognize that in the broad scheme of things, given the situation, it would be of no importance. But of course, that is our situation, and we so often forget about it. I'll just read a little bit from the sutta because it was such a sort of powerful sutta. The king says, there are, Lord, elephant battles fought by head-anointed noble warrior kings intoxicated with the intoxication of sovereignty, obsessed by greed for sensual pleasures, who have attained stable control in their country, and who rule having conquered a great sphere of territory on earth. But there is no use for those elephant battles, no scope for them, when aging and death are rolling in. There are cavalry battles, chariot battles, infantry battles, but there is no use for those infantry battles, no scope for them, when aging and death are rolling in. In this royal court there are counsellors who, when the enemies arrive, are capable of dividing them by their wits, but there is no use for those battles of wits, no scope for them, when aging and death are rolling in. In this royal court there is abundant bullion and gold stored in vaults and depositories, and with such wealth we are capable of buying off enemies when they come. But there is no use for those battles of wealth, no scope for them when aging and death are rolling in. As aging and death are rolling in on me, Lord, what else should be done but Dhamma conduct, right conduct, skillful deeds, meritorious deeds? So you can see there the king has sort of been, he's been woken up to his situation, and he realizes actually that all the sort of little things that we do to try and push back against death, the storing of wealth, the accumulation of wit, the looking to defeat one's enemies, all of those things that we look to do in a way to try and shore our situation up are completely pointless, absolutely, totally pointless. That death will come inevitably anyway. So the right thing to do in that situation is to cultivate what you will be of worth. And just to say, actually, in the Buddhist tradition, many of you will know, but those that don't, in the Buddhist tradition, death is not the end. There is more after that. There's a continuation of consciousness into a new life. And of course, what you bring from this life in the Buddhist tradition to the next one is not status, wealth, power, any of those things, wit, but is how the nature, the sort of perfume, you could say, of your mind. If you have cultivated a beautiful mind, you will bring that with you. If you have cultivated an ugly mind, you will bring that with you. So that is what you get to bring with you, and that is what ultimately matters in the Buddhist tradition at the point of death. Everything else is pointless. Maybe actually just to add as well, because one of the things that maybe what the king would have added in the modern day world is with this mountain rolling in, there are juice fasts, yoga routines, potions, vitamins, ointments, and they're not going to do anything either. This might be sort of bougie London. This might be what I notice in bougie London, yeah. But a lot of sort of emphasis now on all these kind of little health and fitness sort of routines, almost a sort of neurotic kind of obsession with exercise regimens, medicines, herbs, all that type of thing. And oftentimes what you just see behind it is just fear. That's what I've often just clocked with people, is just a very strong sense of fear of getting older, of experiencing pain and then dying. And they're not going to do anything for you in the long term. You know, they might do something in the short, probably not, but they're not going to do anything for you in the long term. Yeah? And it's interesting as well, what often you see with that sort of thing is a kind of neurotic sort of sickliness, a kind of fearfulness. The marketing is health and vitality, isn't it? Sort of glow, health and vitality with all of those various things. But oftentimes what I see behind it is just a sort of feebleness, actually, a sort of fear and a feebleness. So maybe the king would have added juice fasts, yoga regimens, all the rest of it onto that particular list if we were talking today. I think in particular, actually, one of the things that sort of we can think of, given this sort of existential, this burning house of death, is just being less, for me, you know, really just being sort of less complacent around my mental states, less sort of unambitious around my mental states. I can be so sort of unambitious around my mental states. I sort of think it's good. So often I just think, oh, good enough, you know, not suffering, fine, you know, not sort of completely grumpy, fine, you know, not sort of utterly displeasurable, fine. But it's such a lack of sort of ambition for that there as well. I mean, in the sense that as if I just had endless sort of eons to cultivate these positive states, where of course I don't. Bhante Sangharakshita, the man who founded Triratna and the teacher in this particular lineage of Buddhist practice, he often used to say that just with just a little bit more effort, order members could walk around in a state of dilute jhana all day. Now I hear that and think, as if, but he's probably right. In fact, I'm very confident he is right, that if I was just to put a little bit more effort into my mindfulness, into my watching my mental states, that I could probably walk around, unimaginable as it might be to me right now, but walk around in a dilute sense of jhana all day. And it's probably because just I'm not ambitious enough, I'm far too complacent around my mental states, not to make the effort to sort of raise my mind in that particular way. So we can just be very sort of, I can be just very happy with a bit of a grubby mind that isn't too sort of displeasurable at any one time. But as long as it's okay and I can get by, it'll be fine. I'll be very unambitious like that, I'm afraid. So in terms of the children getting out and getting off the wheel, because it's interesting going back to my response to the sister, the nun, isn't it, where I thought, well, that would be the easy way out. And I thought her answer was so good, actually. It was yeah, it would. I thought it was so good because, in a sense, why wouldn't you escape? Well, if you can get out, why wouldn't you get out? Why would you stay? So oftentimes we sort of choose the hard response where we could just sort of step outside. We could just get out. The easier way would just be to sort of step out, and there's no need for us to stay in that particular situation. So what the Buddha is saying, what the Buddha is saying is there is actually an alternative way of doing things. You can just get out. You don't have to be caught up in the games of sort of status and power and all of those things if you don't want to be. You don't get to drop out of life. It's not like that you can't make an effort, because the Dhamma life will require effort of you as well. But you don't have to stay in the burning house. You don't have to stay in the midst of those flames of kind of greed, hatred and delusion. You can look to step out of them. You can be sort of disillusioned with your situation and step out. I was reading just on a sort of an aside actually the other day, and it might be worthwhile saying here, but I was reading Bhante in seminar, and he was talking about the differences between disillusionment with samsara, disillusionment with the burning house, and disgruntlement. He says that many of us come to the spiritual life not so much disillusioned with the world, not seeing through the sort of phantoms and false kind of hopes of samsara, the projects of samsara, the projects of status and power and romance and all the rest of it, not seeing through those, but actually just being disgruntled, not getting what we want in that particular area, and so just sort of rejecting it, just being like, oh, it's all a load of nonsense anyway. I don't want any of that, but actually we really deeply do. I thought it was such a sort of accurate little sort of insight. And so many of us, if we were truly sort of disillusioned with the world, if we were given the opportunity to be very successful at the game of status, power and craving, we wouldn't want to. But so many of us come to the spiritual life not so much disillusioned as disgruntled. We haven't done very well, maybe, necessarily in the world at those games. And we become aversive to it, but secretly we would really like to do quite well in it. And given the opportunity, we'd go back and try it again if we thought. So it's slightly different than Bhante thought what you needed was people who were skilled, effective, happy, positive, can get by in the world, but have actually seen through the sort of illusion of that as well. They're disillusioned as opposed to disgruntled. I suppose it's a really excellent sort of little insight into the nature of our spiritual lives. I think what you don't do, you don't escape the burning house with disgruntlement. You escape the burning house with disillusionment. Disgruntlement often just comes from sort of resentment, doesn't it, and kind of jealousy and envy and all of those things. But you escape the burning house with disillusionment. So what Buddhism is looking to do, what the Buddha is saying is that you can get off the wheel. And traditionally, what's said of Buddhism, what I was saying earlier, is that consciousness does continue with death. And Buddhism paints a bit of a sort of nightmare picture of that, actually, where you sort of die and reborn over and over and over again. And sometimes we can think, oh, that sounds quite nice, actually. I'll come back, I'll be young, I'll be good looking again, I'll have a bit of energy again, you know, that sounds quite good. But you could imagine the nightmare, can't you? You're reborn, you think you can do life on its own terms, you think you can make it satisfactory on its own terms, you grow older, you probably realize that you can't make it satisfactory on its own terms, you die and then you forget. And you do it over and over and over again. I mean, that's like Groundhog Day, isn't it? It's a complete nightmare of a situation. But Buddhism says that, look, you can get off that wheel. You get off that wheel with enlightenment, with nirvana. It's not that is then an end in itself. Something else goes on. It's very hard to say. The Buddha didn't say what would happen after that. But you do get off this wheel of sort of going over and over and over again, rebirth and death, rebirth and death. So Buddhism doesn't teach escapism in the sense that we sometimes think of it, which is looking to sort of ignore the existential situation that you're in or distract yourself from the existential situation that you're in. It does teach escape. It does teach getting out, but it doesn't teach escapism. So it doesn't teach looking to distract ourselves from the problems of our life, for example, with things that sort of, you can pass the time with, whatever that might be, the little projects that we do to sort of distract ourselves, get ourselves away from the deeper questions of life, the more significant questions of life. It doesn't teach escapism in that particular sense. It does teach escape. So it doesn't teach that we sort of escape through games, which is much more like escapism. There's one I'd like to finish up actually just with one sort of final little point. And one facet of the burning house, which is that one facet of the burning house is that we're in it together. In fact, we co-create the burning house together. We co-create the flames of greed, hatred, and delusion together. My greed and hatred is reinforced and reinforces your greed and hatred. You know, when we come together and communicate, because partly it'll be based off a shared possibility for greed, hatred, and delusion. My greed, hatred, and delusion will reinforce and be reinforced by yours. And similarly, your greed, hatred, and delusion will reinforce and be reinforced by mine. So we create this sort of burning house together, don't we? You get that, don't you? You're sort of in a dynamic with somebody. If they're angry with you, it's so hard not to be angry with them back. Maybe for no reason whatsoever, but it's because we sort of reinforce these states within each other that we kind of co-create this kind of burning house together. It's almost impossible. I find it so hard sometimes to not get into a dynamic with somebody who's in a dynamic with me. It's just like I just sort of fall into this burning house with them. One of the very nice things about sharing a room, I shared a room with Dayanatha for 3 years, but one of the things I really love about Dayanatha is that it's impossible to get in a dynamic with him. He just will not do it. He refuses to do it. You get angry with him, he doesn't get angry back. He's sort of just like, no, I'm not gonna do that dynamic with you, Amalayodhin. And it's wonderful because you can't actually get, very frustrating sometimes, you can't get into a dynamic with him. He just won't pick it up with you. He's just like, no, you keep that. I'm okay, thank you very much. And what is just get this great sort of effect where it's like, you deserve a medal to fall out with Dayanatha because it's almost impossible. You know, he just will not get into that sort of dynamic with you. It's, and I've known a few people like that. But of course, most of us, most of the time, co-create this sort of burning house of greed, hatred, and delusion together. We do it together. We create it together. And so what that means is that we'll actually have to leave it together as well. We'll also have to help ourselves out of it together. if we're all creating it, what you then need is a group of people who are doing their very best to put that down, to stop doing that in relationship to each other, so that it doesn't get reinforced with each other through our communication. And that, of course, is what Sangha is. In the parable, the children sort of come tumbling out. But in reality, what happens is the Buddha, the old man is the Buddha in the story, makes this call. And then in reality, what you need to do, what I think you really need to do, is start to help each other out in that particular way. Those that know the way start to sort of guide people who are a little further behind. Those that are a little further behind are helping each other in all their various ways to sort of make their way out. And that's the only way that we're going to escape this particular burning house. So with that, I thought I'd leave you with a little bit of a story, because I opened up with this, saying about my time in Gaza. But I'll leave you with a little bit of a story. And it was a story of, I was out, so this one particular day, I lived in Gaza for a time for about 3 months, and 3-4 months. And I remember this one particular morning, I was out with these Gaza fishermen. And this particular fisherman, just to give you a bit of a backstory, the Israeli Navy enforces sort of 3 to 6 mile kind of barrier on how far you can fish. So these Palestinian fishermen go out each morning, and they sort of play this game of kind of cat and mouse with the Israeli Navy. It was quite an unusual situation, because Gaza, if it wasn't in the situation that it was, if it wasn't a war zone basically, would probably be a tourist resort. I mean, it's right on the Mediterranean. It's absolutely beautiful. It's really stunning. You get these sort of palm trees and beaches and dunes and all of these sorts of things. A bit like Alexandria. If people have been to Alexandria in Egypt, it's the same sort of scene. But we went out, and we were playing this, so the Israeli Navy were sort of playing this game of cat and mouse with the fishermen, where the fishermen, because the waters are overfished, they try and keep on sort of pushing further and further out. So you get this situation where these gunboats will come by and sort of shoot into the water in front of the boats, getting to look to turn them back around. And so this particular morning, this Gaza fisherman put me up the front of the boat, so that there was clearly a Westerner in the boat, and he reckoned that would get another kilometre or two out of the Israeli Navy. Yeah. So I'm up at the front of the boat. I'm like, are you sure this is all right? It's near this game. But amazing, an incredible situation, because you've got dolphins off the coast of Gaza and everything. They come and sort of play in the trough of the boat as it goes past. So very unusual. You've got gunboats firing machine guns and dolphins sort of firing and coming up as well. So, but this Gaza fisherman, I was talking to him a little bit about his life, and he told me this story, because prior to Gaza being blockaded in 2008 or so, Gazans would go in and out into Israel beyond the border at not Rafah, I forget what the Israeli border is, but and they'd go and they'd have sort of building jobs or whatever it might be there, and then they'd come back in the evening. Yeah, so you get these sort of casual labourers would go in. And he was telling me a story how he had an Israeli friend who he was very, very close friends with, made a very, very close friendship with, and at the time of the blockade, basically couldn't travel to his old place of work, and also couldn't see his Israeli Jewish friend either. So the two guys were the word he used was heartbroken, actually, at not being able to sort of see each other anymore. So what they decided to do was the Israeli Jewish man got a friendly imam within Israel, a friendly Muslim sheikh within Israel, and he signed the papers saying that he was Muslim. And so this Israeli Jewish man made Hajj with this Palestinian man at the same time. Hajj is when you go to Mecca to go to pilgrimage. It's one of the 5 duties within Islam. So this Israeli Jewish man and this Palestinian Muslim so to try and to see each other one last time, to get to see each other one last time in this deep friendship that they'd formed, they went to Hajj together to make pilgrimage, and this Israeli Jewish man actually really risking his neck to do that as well. And I was deeply moved by the story, deeply moved by the story. I couldn't really, was sort of just, yeah, well, very moved by it, still am now. And, you know, whatever the situation, whatever the solution to the conflict in Gaza at the moment, it's going to involve a lot more of that. It's going to have to involve a lot more of that, where two people start to help themselves out of a burning house. Yeah? When two people refuse to pick up those clubs and sticks of hatred and greed and delusion, and start to help themselves out of a burning house. And of course, what more beautiful vision could you have of friendship and Sangha than that? So I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that story for today.